Part 7. So we looked at futurism, continuous movement through space. I have a hard time with the futurists just because I don't see it as visually compelling to match their theory. It doesn't totally make sense to me. At any rate, then we're going to get into our last segment, or our second to last segment, body. Oh, I guess we have three more. The sickness and death. Now, this is Hannah Wilke, and I didn't really care for her work at first. I thought it was really odd. But what's interesting about this, and you don't see presented here in 1992, is that 20 years earlier, in 72, and before that as well, I believe in the 60s, she would appear nude or semi-nude at art openings of her own and other people's. She really had this idealized body herself, and she posed nude, in a lot of her work. So when she became ill, she decided to continue to do the nude photos because she felt like, this is part of what happens to the body. And she's doing some poses here that are, this is called intravenous, meaning, as opposed to intravenal, like in your vein. But the idea of like Venus and those poses and looking pretty and so on. But in reality, she was undergoing multiple surgeries and died. But she decided to show her cancer treatment in this way, which was kind of unheard of. Nobody really did that before. So she is posing in a way that you would see in a men's magazine, so sexually attractive nudes. And of course, she has started to lose her hair, and there's her bandages as well, some swelling, and her perfect figure that she once had is starting to fall apart a bit. You can see more swelling here abdominally from her surgery. So she is commenting on our sense of admiring the human form. And her glance is implying the presence of a sexual partner. Well, that's always true of pornography, because that's the idea, is that you're pretending to look at someone who's in the room with you, but that's not always the case. So she is making some commenting on the idea of sexuality and attraction, and she's reclaiming her sexuality here, its sickness, and challenging our ideas about attractiveness. Another a grim photo, absolutely grim. So there's some things in this book that I'm not feeling like would be the greatest subject matter to show you guys at your age, but this is what a lot of artwork looks like over time. And once photography is invented, we start to see really close-ups of death and dismemberment. So this is a striking worker that was assassinated, and the documentation of a brutal act that our photographer is trying to show. This is Manuel Alvarez Bravo, and he is showing what happens when some of the corporations and so on have struck down these people that were trying to ask for better money. So we looked at Sacco and Vanzetti, if you remember that, back in chapter 10. So this is similar, but this has even more power to it because it can't be romanticized, if that makes sense. So this idea of a disturbing image, it's close up and immediate, and it borders on, how do you want to say, it borders on being overexposure and exploitative of the person, but it's trying to prove this point of how people are treated. So it's a political piece. Okay, we're going to get in the psychological dimension in art, and much art is related to these things. Our Scream here, you've already seen this before you ever cracked this book, I'm sure, is a very famous painting, or some version of that. They have dolls now that are kind of like those blow up advertising things you see. I've seen one by my house. A cell phone company has this figure that's inflated with air and waves around. I've seen blow ups of that. So art is in which the body is affected by emotional and mental forces. So that's getting depicted more so than reality. So I know you guys get really attached to the idea of how realistic is the artwork, but are we talking about physical realism or mental or psychological realism? Okay, so that is what we're going to look at, the emotional state. So the scream is a distorted body, like it just gets into hairlessness and skeletal, and that's getting toward the emotion, and the body becomes elongated, and there's no muscles to it. So this is just a purely emotional feeling coming out of Edvard Munch down here, the most famous Norwegian painter ever, 1893. Now he's before the modern era. Modern era is still a good 20 years away, but he is doing this expressive, abstracted. This is realistic. This pier over the water. There's water here, and this pier is done in a good amount of perspective in a correct kind of proportional way. But everything has gotten really crazy and blended together. If you ever notice when you're really stressed or go through an emergency, or say an ambulance comes or some other sort of event, you're injured, or you get bad news, like terribly bad news. Everything seems to go funhouse, in our vision and in our perception of things. And it's a proven fact that the more stressed you are, and the more under in a traumatic moment, the less you can actually visually see. It's meant to have you focus on what is absolutely essential for survival. So that's a physiological thing that does happen in the body, and we're seeing this where he's very stressed, and everything kind of just gets really simplified and a bit blurry, if that makes sense. The other thing I want to point out here in the coloration of the sky, they believe that this during this time frame there was a volcanic eruption that changed the color of the sky. I think in many parts of the world, but in Europe in particular, because Norway and parts of Northern Europe tend to have more moisture in the sky, so perhaps it grabbed a lot more of those volcanic particles and dust and made more of these incredible sunsets. Krakatoa, which happens at a different time, not too far back from this, Krakatoa affects the Earth's temperature and the sunsets for 7 years, just to give you a sense of that. So back to our reality of our screamer, he's going through an extreme, emotional isolation. Notice these figures, these friends he might be with, are small and far away, and he feels very deformed and distorted. Now Edvard Munch himself did undergo treatment for his mental health. And let me see back here. Oh, it doesn't say. One of these is painted on cardboard, if you can believe it. And there are 3 versions of the same painting. And this one is in Oslo, Norway. And one of the versions was stolen. It's a very famous case. So a double mask. So this is Cameroon, Africa. And this is also called a Janus head in Greco-Roman terms. And you'll see this, now that you've seen this once, you'll see this repeatedly in multiple cultures. So here we are in the Cameroon, which is quite a ways south in Africa. But in Europe, this double-sided face is also